Well, hello friends, welcome back to the shop. We are beginning the final video in this series on the restoration of the Royal Ascot Supreme that we're doing for the Durham Duke. And as I mentioned in the first video, the stummel itself is in really good shape, and that's the focus for really most of the remaining work. We've got that, and we've got a little bit of fine-tuning to do on the stem. So this really does not require any obvious sanding. There's a few spots that I pointed out in the overview video that I'll probably touch up just a bit, these spots down here. But for the most part, this is in really good shape. Now there is some areas where I had to sand into the finish a little bit here when I was fitting the stem, but that's not going to be a problem. We will use some high grit, probably 400 grit sandpaper to even that out and also take care of these spots. But the first thing we're going to do before we even think about sanding is we're going to clean this off and take off the current finish. And to do that, we're going to use acetone. So I've got a little bit hard to bring this in here, but I've got a can of acetone here. And I'm just using these, this is a shop towel that's been ripped into quarters and just folded over a few times. So I'll make a nice absorbent pad. And I will, off screen obviously, load this up with some acetone. Now, acetone's a great chemical to do this sort of stuff with. It's a much better solvent for a lot of things than alcohol. Of course, it's also a bit more nasty, doesn't smell as good, and does an excellent job of drying things out. So there we go. So you can see that's starting to remove the wax. Really not a lot of finish, and as I suspected, I think this is kind of proving the point here that this pipe did not actually have a stain. This was a natural finish. Because we're really seeing no stain at all come off of this, even though this is lightening up quite a bit as we're removing the wax. So that's good. We will, I mean, the stain was, the grain was already quite stunning on this, so the fact that it was not stained means that we're going to really be able to highlight that with a bit of a contrast stain, and that should really turn out nicely. So what I'm going to do then is I will continue to clean this up, and then I will do that little bit of sanding, and I'll bring you back when we start staining the pipe. So I'll be back soon. Okay, so we are now ready to apply the stain. We've gone over the whole pipe with acetone twice actually, and then using 400 grit sandpaper. I sanded the entire stummel, being very careful around the stamping, so just a couple of light swipes on both sides of the stampings. But I did that basically to make sure that everything is smooth and ready to accept the stain and the finish. This area here on the bottom, I do believe those are some small defects in the briar. They're not scratches, they're not, it's smooth, it's sanded smooth basically. So we'll see how that looks after the staining, but I don't think that's going to be much of a problem. And if nothing else, it's going to lend a little bit of character to the pipe. So I have it on one of my experimental stems that didn't work out too well, which makes a handy holder. So I will hold it with this. I'm going to heat this, which is something I often do with the counter stain. So I'll get the pipe hot using an air gun, and then I will apply the stain, which in this case is going to be dark walnut, and this is the Vermont Freehand dark walnut. So I'll go ahead and do that. I'll heat it off camera, but you will hear the heat gun, and I'll probably edit out most of that because it's just going to be noise. And then when I come back, you'll see me applying the stain. Alright, so we'll start with the rim. And the idea here is to, as near as possible, just give a single coat. The reason being is that with the stain being alcohol soluble, each time you go over it, you're really not darkening it at all, you're just dissolving the layer that you put on. So multiple coats don't really help much with this sort of dye. I'm going to try to minimize the dye that goes in the stamping, mainly because I don't want to do too much sanding around the stamping, and it'll be easy enough to blend that in. I just realized that I forgot to wear gloves while I'm doing this. I usually do wear gloves. Hopefully I already got it on me. Okay. Alright, there we go. So we will just let this set overnight, and we'll do the final sanding tomorrow. Well, we've allowed the stain to set overnight, and this is the final stained pipe. Now we still need to sand off the majority of the stain, and we're just going to leave the stain that's sunk into the grain behind. We also did a little bit of work on the stem, just thinned it down just a tiny bit in here. The main reason I did that was, the stem that we're trying to copy is one of these sort of bulky bent stems, and I wanted to make sure that when we go to bend this, that we're going to be able to bend it. And it was just a little bit too thick. There was a bit of a hump in here. It didn't look good either. So I think we're in really good shape with this now. I really like the shape. So the next step is going to be to sand everything. So I'm going to start with, this is 400 grit Abernet, and I will sand the stummel to both, completely sand it with 400, and then I'll sand it with 600. And this is a light sanding, so I'm not really trying to smooth anything out. We're just trying to basically remove the surface, and that will expose the underlying stain that's in the grain. So we'll do that on the whole pipe, both 400, 600, and then this will be ready for buffing. On the stem, we'll actually start with 220 grit. You can see there's some spots like right in here where we still have some marks from the filing that need to be taken down. But we'll sand the whole thing with 220 grit, and then we'll do 320, 400, 600, and then this will be ready for the buffer. And once we buff, we will be ready to see the final product. And here we are, ready for the buffer. So we've got everything sanded now to 600 grit, which is fine if you're going to start buffing with Tripoli. That seems to be a fine enough sanding. I know some people will go much higher grit than that, but I found that it really doesn't seem to help very much. And the sanding, of course, is what takes a great deal of time. Now the grain looks a bit muted because it's been sanded, it hasn't been polished yet, or waxed, obviously. But you can get an idea of how the grain is going to look just by lightly with a barely damp cloth, just wipe across this and wet it a bit, and you can see the grain is definitely coming out nicely on this. So I think we're in good shape. So now we will go off to the buffing wheel. We'll buff both the stem and the stummel. And once that's done, the last thing we need to do before we can call this pipe finished is we need to put a bend in the shank. And I'll probably do that off camera because it's not terribly interesting. I'm just going to hold it over a heat gun for a while until this softens enough, and then very carefully bend it. And at that point we will have a finished product. So I'll bring you back once it's done. Well, folks, we have a finished pipe here. This is the final look of the Royal Ascot Supreme that we have revitalized for the Durham Duke. And I will take you through the pipe one last time just to let you know what we've done. So you can see the stummel's all nice and shiny now. It's been buffed and waxed. And the grain has been accentuated by a dark walnut contrast stain. And we've left the remaining briar natural. And I think in this case that really was the right choice, because the grain on this pipe is just so spectacular that really it doesn't need to be black, it doesn't need to be high contrast, and it just really accentuates the beauty of this piece of wood and reminds you that it is in fact a piece of wood. You know, it's a natural product, and I just think it looks beautiful. So I think we made a really good choice with that. The stem is again an acrylic stem. Obviously it's shaped a bit differently from when you last saw it. It's bent now, and that's what the Durham Duke had requested. We did thin this down a bit, in particular in this region. Remember, we have to keep it somewhat thick up here because of the filter. But we thinned this down quite a bit here, and the reason for that was, well, we originally were modeling this on a Savinelli stem that the Durham Duke had picked out as a basis for what he wanted to see. And, you know, it seemed like a good idea, and that's what I modeled the stem on. And as I was getting close to the end, I was thinking, yeah, this is a little thick for this pipe. But I didn't want to bring it up because he really seemed to want that stem, and, you know, I'd commented on several times. Here the whole time he was thinking, yeah, that's a little thick for this pipe, but he didn't want to bring it up because he knew I had put a lot of work into it. Fortunately, we've become friends during this very long process, getting ready to work on this pipe, and eventually it was possible for us to talk about this, and we both reached the conclusion that the stem should be thinner, and I'm glad we did, because I think it looks much more in balance with the rest of the pipe now. It's got a very nice flow to it. The material I think is beautiful. It's got a wood-like grain to it. This is an orange-black acrylic, and it really just flows nicely into the pipe, and just accentuates that natural briar color. The stem is a filter stem, so this will accept the 6mm filters that he likes to use. And again, we used a Delrin tenon here because the walls were so thin. The acrylic was a bit too prone to crack. But the Delrin is a nice tough material that has a bit of give to it, and that should last him for many, many years. So there we have it. I hope you've enjoyed watching this process and seeing the final result here. I hope the Durham Duke is happy with this. It'll be speeding off to him in the mail next week. And I want to thank you all for your time in watching this. If you've enjoyed this and you'd like to see similar projects, I've got more of these sorts of things lined up in the near future, so please go ahead and subscribe if you're not already a subscriber. If you are, well, thank you for that. I really appreciate that. And as always, any comments or questions you have would be very much appreciated. And if you have a pipe that you would like to see get the same kind of treatment, be brought back to life, or just get spruced up a bit, please go ahead and check out my website at canerodpipes.com. We'd love to hear from you there and help you out in any way that I can. So with that, I will say thank you once again for watching, and until next time, I will look forward to talking to you all again very soon. Goodbye now.